so let's just open today's hybrid Hot Politics Lab. Welcome everybody in Amsterdam. It's a pleasure also to welcome all of you that joined via the Zoom. It's a pleasure to introduce Professor Hannah Naam, who is an assistant professor at Stony Brook University. And Stony Brook, it's really the place where sort of maybe at least within political science, where political psychology is really a stronghold. And we always look with some desire at Stony Brook as if we could hopefully create an atmosphere that is as vibrant and good as the Stony Brook environment. So we try to do this, and it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Naam, who has published widely using a variety of methods ranging from fMRI and to survey methodology. Recently published a paper with lesion patients, which is sort of one of the it must really suck to have a lesion, but it seems, at least in terms of methodology, a very cool way to get at some of the causal aspects of what in the brain do we need in order to function in a democracy. So I'm really excited that we can finally have Professor Naam here today. I will stop talking and give the floor over to her. And then for those of you who join via the Zoom, you can ask your questions after the talk by typing it in the Q&A box. And Gijs in Amsterdam will answer, will not answer them, he will read them out, and Professor Naam will answer them. So that's just how we do it. Although Gijs can obviously also answer difficult questions. But Hannah, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Bert. That's very kind introduction. I have to say that I really admire from afar what's going on over there in the Politics Lab. I hope I have the opportunity one day to visit you all in person. It seems like an incredibly cool setup that you all have going. I'm such a fan of the work that comes out of this lab, and just it's just sort of like, I don't know, a model for how we can do these kind of really great interdisciplinary work. So I really appreciate the invitation today. So should I start doing screen share now? Okay, let's see here. I will try to do this correctly. Do you see my screen? Okay, I'll try to do full screen. Do you see my full screen slide?
No, now we see your presentation.
Oh, it's a presentation setting? Okay, let me try to change that. How about now?
Yeah, now we see your full screen.
Now the full screen? Okay,
yeah.
Great. Okay, so as Bert mentioned, I have a little bit of work looking at, so I thought I'd just tell you a little bit of personal backstory for what motivated this project, which is really about sort of thinking about the consequences of attributing genetic attributions for different kinds of outcomes in social group settings. And part of our sort of, this is work that I'm doing with Catherine Sawyer, also at Stony Brook University. And part of the sort of personal motivation for this, for both of us, came out of our sort of shared interest in incorporating biological methods in studying political issues. So as Bert mentioned, I have a little bit of work looking at brain structure using MRI and lesion patient approaches in understanding political outcomes. And Catherine has some work looking at genetic associations for different types of political and identities and behaviors. And so through our conversations, we'd sort of, I'm sure this is something that's quite familiar to you all, but we had noticed that we very often got sort of two poles of responses to this kind of research. One was either people just don't believe it, right? They think politics is very complicated. It's a very complicated process, outcome, something that people consider, right? This is a very common layperson belief, and it cannot possibly be associated with something as basic as biology. And on the other hand, the other sort of extreme end of the spectrum of reaction we noticed was that people would buy it a little too much, believe it a little too much, right? Where they say, oh, then this means that we're all predetermined. There's no hope for us. We're all just the product of our genes and our brains. And so we might as well stop talking to each other. And so, well, obviously, I think obviously these both are not quite right. And so we were starting to get worried about the consequences of our own research and what it might be doing to sort of broader public perceptions about the relationship between biology and social and political outcomes. So we started, so this is part of a sort of broader project that we're trying to conceptualize and thinking about the consequences of the biology of social and political outcomes. We started with a context in which we thought was particularly pertinent in the United States, perhaps even worldwide. I would love to get your perspective on this too. And so we're looking at this first in the domain of intergroup racial dynamics. So I'm going to tell you about one study that we've conducted and a planned study that we would like to launch quite soon. So all of your constructive feedback on how best to sort of ask these questions going forward would be very, very much appreciated. And that's like especially why I'm so excited to be here today. Okay. That's my meandering backstory. Okay, so this is just a sampling of some of the science articles in a variety of media outlets over the past few years. And we think that this suggests there's quite an interest in reporting genetics research that links certain genes to important human outcomes, including health outcomes like obesity, asthma, cancer, as well as some specific behavioral outcomes like violence. So health is typically more common in this kind of reporting, but increasingly these kinds of behavioral outcomes are also reported on. Across media outlets, certainly the headlines, as you can see here, and often the articles themselves, they present pretty simplified causal narratives about the relationship between genes and outcomes. And what we've observed is another frequent characteristic of these articles that they can highlight how genes might account for intergroup or interracial differences in specific types of behavioral and health outcomes. So I don't know if you can see this very well here, but like poor Calvin here in this little cartoon, who has gotten in trouble for throwing rocks inside the house and makes the poor choice of attributing poor genetic material to his mom for his behavior. Most people seem to readily believe that genes play a causal deterministic role in human behavior and outcomes. So people think that genes are a primary cause in a lot of different human traits like intelligence, disability, athletic ability, sexuality, height. Of course, they believe this less so for more complex, seemingly complex things like political ideology and religiosity and belief systems. However, an increasing number of studies examine associations between genetic variants and all kinds of behavioral phenotypes, as you are well aware, right? Including things like disease, divorce, ideology, voting behavior, violence, and the media seem to love to report on these kinds of relationships. So at one extreme, perhaps you are familiar with this kind of event, but genetics science is used very explicitly by white supremacists to assert racial superiority, right? Even in somewhat ridiculous or comical ways. Here, what you're seeing is a milk chugging party where a group of white supremacists got together to just drink lactose together. And this is to celebrate their sort of racial dominance because of some genetic science that suggests that people descended from European heritage have a higher likelihood of being able to process lactose than folks from other areas of the world. So this is kind of funny, but it's also kind of an extreme example. But with our research, we'd like to suggest that, right, this is something that can happen at one extreme when you really buy into this any kind of genetic science that supports your ideology. But we like to suggest that genetic sort of justification is not simply a characteristic, specific to extremists, but rather that descriptions of small intergroup differences in genes could affect racial attitudes more broadly in negative ways. You might notice that there's a little picture of Ted Cruz in the top left corner, I don't know how familiar you are with American politicians, but he's a prominent Republican senator, former presidential candidate. I don't know why his pictures, I didn't put it there. It's just part of white supremacist material. So I guess they think of him as a kindred spirit. So sort of the theoretical backdrop for some of this is this idea that old-fashioned racism, which is really this belief that compared to white people, Black people are biologically inferior. This is in contrast to more modern versions of racism after the civil rights era in the United States, which was more based on a moral feeling about Black people versus white people and violating traditional American values. So this sort of old-fashioned perception of biological inferiority seems to be in some way making a comeback in the American political landscape, and insofar as overt expressions of racism, of sort of this kind of superiority, it seems to be becoming more acceptable in political and social rhetoric. And so we wondered, could objective scientific information regarding genetics in an intergroup context help to justify racism and racial disparities in the American context? So there are a few reasons we might think this could be true. Genetic science itself has proliferated in recent decades since the inception of the Human Genome Project in 1990, and that has probably, quite intuitively been accompanied by increased media coverage. Genetic scientific findings are presented as objective, factual, and non-ideological, so hard to argue with, right? So if you present that as part of your evidence for something, it's much more difficult to refute it. And there's some social psychological research that suggests that when racial group membership is presented as biologically determined, racial inequities are seen as more acceptable. And that is importantly, regardless of individual differences in racial prejudice. So you can see this sort of shift in perceptions about the sort of hard boundaries between racial groups, even if you are someone who considers yourself low prejudice. So we thought that modern advances in science and technology that we use in our own research could play potentially an outsized, if unintended, role in the resurgence of old-fashioned racism by providing, evidence, quote unquote evidence, for claiming fundamental racial differences and consequently justifying inequities. Part of the reason for this stems from psychological literature that people tend to be genetic essentialists, and in the context of race, this has the potential to form an ideological double helix in which two related but distinct psychological processes can contribute to people's fixed perceptions about the natural divisions between racial categories. So on the one hand, we have biological determinism, which is simply the idea that genes are destiny, right? Your genes are linked to inevitable predetermined outcomes. When race itself is geneticized, race is perceived as not only inherited, but caused by clear biological markers. But we know from human behavioral genetics work that phenotypes, the vast majority of phenotypes typically emerge from the interaction of many genes when certain environmental conditions are present and as a function of personal choice factors. And genetics research also suggests that racial categories do not map clearly onto genetic markers. Even if there are some correlations that can be found, right, the sort of broad socially determined categories of race are not very evident when you look at DNA mapping. Racial essentialism is a related process, a related psychological process that suggests that genes are immutable and innate, and so any associated outcomes are also immutable and innate. That is, genes form the essence of who a person is in all our complexity. Genes are really sort of the core of who we are. And so when perceived differences between groups are attributed to biology, those differences can also be seen as natural differences in essence. And people hold these perceptions of racial differences as reflecting differences in biological essence. So something that we've been puzzling over and that seems to be a sort of a contrast in the literature on this topic is this question of how genetic attributions affect perceptions in an intergroup context. So on the one hand, a lot of research in genetic essentialism literature suggests that genetic attributions and sort of these associated psychological processes are associated with greater levels of intolerance. They're associated with perceptions of greater group homogeneity, greater levels of stereotyping, greater levels of prejudice expression. On the other hand, there is also some research that suggests that genetic attributions are associated with greater levels of tolerance. So this suggests that when you make genetic attributions for some outcome, people make reduced culpability attributions, less assignment of responsibility, lower levels of condemnation, and greater levels of sympathy for the person in question. So this is like the fundamental puzzle that we're trying to understand here. Why is tolerance extended to some but not to others? And so this is very much our working theory. And this is the kind of specific at least at this point, to like American or like white dominant context. We have sort of speculated that when an outcome is not tied to a minority racial or ethnic identity, and therefore sort of implicitly or explicitly is assumed to be tied to a white identity, genetic attributions could lead people to be more accepting of those outcomes. But for racial and ethnic minorities, we think it's possible that genetic explanations could foster these more deterministic biases that reinforce negative beliefs toward the whole group, resulting in increased expression of prejudiced attitudes. And so this sort of like working theory is consistent with this idea that these tendencies can serve to justify and bolster existing racial and ethnic hierarchies in our society. Okay, so broadly our research questions that we're trying to address with our first and second study is what might be the consequences for racial attitudes, as well as ideological and policy preferences when we show people scientific narratives that simplify genetic attributions as causal and suggest interracial differences in genetic composition. And is it possible that negative racial attitudes could be improved through narratives that actually emphasize the complex and conditional nature of genetic outcomes, something that's a little truer to how we should interpret genetic effects? So our hypotheses are quite straightforward. We think that narratives emphasizing a deterministic genetic relationship with some behavioral outcome will lead to more racist attitudes, which we're testing in both studies. In the first study, we're also testing a prediction that narratives that emphasize a conditional genetic relationship should buffer these negative racist attitude effects. And that is, a conditional narrative should not lead to more racist attitudes compared to the baseline. And in study 2, we're trying to sort of zero in a little bit more on sort of what it is. Is it really a genetic narrative that matters in these racial contexts? So we're predicting that genetically deterministic as opposed to environmental narratives in a racialized context should be leading to more overtly racist attitudes. And we're also exploring the effects on policy preferences in racialized policy domains. Okay, so the first study, we're testing this question about deterministic genetic narratives versus conditional narratives and their impact on racial attitudes. We're using a national sample in the US from the survey firm Dynata. We conducted a 2-wave experiment with 3 sort of primary aims here, where we're looking at changes in overt racism and expression of overt racism between wave 1 and wave 2. And we wanted to sort of disentangle whether it matters whether we're talking about genes or race or both together when it comes to consequences for racial attitudes. And on a more exploratory basis, I'm not sure if I will necessarily discuss this because of time, but we wanted to sort of look at potential mechanism, right? Does essentialist thinking play a role in this relationship? So we also looked at treatment effects on essentialist beliefs themselves. So this is a sort of a snapshot of the treatment structure. So people were randomly assigned to one of 4 treatments or a control news article. There are 2 dimensions on which we varied the narrative. One is whether the genetic narrative was framed deterministically, right? that shows that the warrior gene contributes to violent crime. This describes real genetics research that found a link between genes and violent behavior. And the text emphasized the role of the gene MAOA variant in manifestations of extremely violent behavior. The conditional genetic narrative, on the other hand, read a very similar news article associating this gene with violent outcomes, but it sort of emphasized the complexity of the issue given a large environmental component, and quoting an expert who asserted that these genes most emphatically do not predetermine you for a life of crime. The other dimension was whether we talked about race at all. So in the no race condition, we didn't talk about race. We didn't mention race in any way, but in the race or the Black treatment condition, there was just simply one additional statement about the variability between Blacks and whites in the incidence of this variant of the MAOA gene, suggesting that Blacks had a higher incidence of this variant than whites. And the control condition was an environmental treatment that didn't talk about genes, didn't talk about race. So these are our primary basic results. The DV for our primary result was a measure of overt racism, as I mentioned, which is akin to conceptions of old-fashioned racism, which measures how much people believe that economic disparities between Blacks and whites are due to fundamental genetic differences between races and racial differences in intelligence. So you can see this is an attitude about racial inequality that's in the economic domain, not about the treatment outcome, which was violence. And what we find is that compared to the control condition, the baseline, people express more negative racial attitudes only in the deterministic genetic narrative that indicates, greater prevalence of this gene in the Black population. So I'll note two things about this result. If this was a purely race effect, then we would also expect to see an increase in the conditional race condition, which we don't. So this suggests that this is the intersection of race and genetic explanations that could lead to a change in attitudes. It also appears that racial attitudes could be affected more broadly by getting a genetically deterministic explanation about violence that implicates Blacks. And so it seems possible that these kinds of genetic explanations could bleed into other outcome domains, or at least justify inequalities in them. I'm going to skip over this for now, actually, since it looks like I'm running a little low on time, but I'm happy to come back to this in the Q&A or the broader discussion if people are interested. But basically here we're seeing that it's sort of important to not talk about race when we're talking about genes in order to not affect people's essentialist beliefs. Okay, so this is our planned study 2. Here we're trying to narrow in a little bit more on how much it matters, especially for expressions of this overt or old-fashioned racism, to be talking about the effects of genes as opposed to other kinds of attributions like the environment, as well as thinking about more broadly about like what effects there could be for political outcomes like policy preferences. So this is it. So what we're doing here is we're I guess like what I just said. I don't need to repeat that from these slides. So here's the treatments that we have planned for our next study. We're again looking at the same outcome, the same MAOA warrior gene association with violence. And we're either giving people a genetic narrative or an environmental narrative. The genetic narrative is exactly the same as the genetically deterministic narrative in study 1. But the environmental narrative is actually the control treatment from study 1, where we're attributing violence to traumatic events in childhood, so an environmental explanation. And again, we're varying whether we talk about race or not. And in the race condition, we talk about sort of Black-white differences in prevalence for these different types of attributions. And the control condition here is a completely unrelated topic. So our study design is very similar. It's very parallel to the initial study. We are again planning a 2-wave experiment. In wave 1, where we're measuring, the overt racism measure, as well as a number of demographic covariates. And a week or 2 later, we will administer wave 2, in which people will get the experimental treatments that I just showed you, measure their overt levels of racism again, as well as explore a variety of policy attitudes that are racialized in the United States, things like issues of segregation, the death penalty, police brutality, and funding. No, that's a typo there. It should say police, not policy brutality. Black Lives Matter, the issue of reparations in the United States, as well as sort of exploring potential effects on racialized ideology like alt-right sympathy and identification. And our expectations are reasonably simple, I think. In the no race conditions, we think that it shouldn't look too different from the control baseline when we're not talking about race at all. But in the race treatments, we think that the genetic narratives should increase levels of overt racism and increase more people's sort of punitive policy preferences. We expect that we could see this sort of pattern of effects in the environmental narrative as well, but perhaps to a lesser degree, insofar as there might be less of a natural match between an environmental narrative and thinking about race in sort of racism in these sort of like biological terms. Okay, so just to quickly wrap up, we have some evidence, we think here, that scientific and media portrayals of genetics research explaining outcomes in intergroup context could impact the public's racial attitudes. This could be particularly pernicious in the current political backdrop of increasing racial hostility. And we think that we have some preliminary evidence that one way to intervene in this is by contextualizing the effects of genes in the narratives about the effects of genetics in different kinds of outcomes. That could potentially serve as an effective intervention, but of course that is something to be explored further. In terms of implications, we think that popular conceptions of DNA and the increasing availability of these direct-to-consumer genetic tests suggest that genes as identity and destiny are really alluring psychologically. So to the extent that people are more and more accepting of biological and genetic explanations for cultural and ethnic heritage, the more relevant these ideas should become for them. These are just some screen grabs from a popular commercial for Ancestry.com, a direct-to-consumer genetic test company, in which Kyle here, an American guy, Kyle, thought his whole life that his cultural and ethnic background was German. And so he's celebrating that on the left here by wearing his lederhosen and doing, I guess, a German dance. I apologize for my ignorance about sort of German cultural heritage, but that's what he's doing in the commercial. Then he takes a DNA test. He finds out that over half of his genetic background is actually Scottish. And so that changes his whole identity. He dons a kilt and learns Scottish cultural traditions. And obviously this is like a silly example from a commercial. But to the extent that people really buy into these kinds of genetic tests and like what they say about your cultural background, and that affects how they see themselves and other people, we think this could be potentially impactful. This is another sort of recent kind of shocking commercial for Aeromexico, an airline company in Mexico, where they went to anti-Mexican Americans who said they would never visit Mexico, they don't like Mexico, whatever, and gave them DNA tests. And then they had a promotion where based on their DNA test, based on the percent of their DNA that they were Mexican, they got a corresponding discount on flights to Mexico. So there was like an incentive to be quote unquote more Mexican or to get more of a discount. They end the commercial with this beautiful tagline, "There are no borders within us." But to me, this kind of thing sort of like shows the weird irony in that they might actually be inadvertently highlighting geopolitical borders through this sort of biological approach, reinforcing these kinds of these sort of group distinctions. I will skip this because it's just like a long list of a lot of future directions that we're thinking about and would like to pursue in the future, but I'm happy to talk about any of these with you, especially if you think that there are particularly fruitful or useful future directions for us to be taking on. And so I will end there. And thank you so much for your attention. And thank you again so much for inviting me to participate in your lab meeting today. And I really look forward to the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Hannah, for this really exciting research and for giving us also the opportunity to give some comments before you're collecting the second study, right? That's yeah,
yes,
okay.
Yes.
That's really great. So as always, the people online, you can type your questions into the Q&A box, and I will read them aloud. And for the people here in the room, you can gently signal your preference to ask a question, and then hopefully I will see it. And I will give you the floor. There are already two hands here, so let me move to Christian.
Thank you, Hannah. I have a very quick question, just clarification in your new study. What do you do with the policy preferences? How do you measure that? What kind of policy preferences are they? Is that policy preferences regarding race, or I didn't really get that part?
The policy preferences that we're thinking about are really in the domains of issues that have been racialized in the US. So I can pull that back up. So there are, oh, I'm confused by my own slides here. Let me see if I can screen share that again. Do you see that here? So basically, after we ran the first studies, right, we've been really focused on an outcome of looking at racial attitudes, and especially sort of thinking about overt racism. And some of the feedback we've gotten following that, right, is that it really would be interesting to see if there are, political implications of this, right? Are there, does this potentially affect how people think that Black people should be treated, or people more broadly should be treated in the context of the US political system? And so this would be akin to, right, sort of these old-fashioned historical policy contexts in the US where, of course, racist attitudes were associated with racist policies like, institutionalized, formalized segregation. And here we're trying to sort of get a little bit of a sense for these domains where these policy issues are racialized in the US, and seeing if there's any potential movement as a function of these kinds of attributions for race.
Thanks. Next question is for Diamantis.
Hello, Anna. Thank you so much for this interesting talk. It's very rarely that we hear these ideas on like reflecting ideas of how our research and our ideas can actually have an impact, and what's the impact to others. So I'm quite impressed by the fact that you take this into account within the more broad perspective of your project. I have two questions. One is like a quite straightforward clarification question. It's about perhaps like controlling for individual differences in how people think about the nurture versus nature sort of rhetoric, and whether this explains actually variation in the outcomes. Mm-hmm. And the other question I have is whether you have considered to move towards like other topics as well. So now you're looking on the influence of this discourse about genes and versus environment on the topic of violence. And I was thinking whether you would expect to have like other outcomes on topics like, I don't know, addiction or climate change or so.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. That's those are both really astute points. So the sort of individual variability in nurture versus nature beliefs certainly should play a role, we think. That is, I think, some aspect of that is captured in sort of individual variability in these essentialist beliefs, which is this idea that people think that all kinds of human outcomes can be boiled down to their genes, or differences in the ways that they behave can really be boiled down to genes. That doesn't really address the nurture aspect of it, of course, but it sort of is an aspect of how much people think that nature really is the fundamental cause for things. It should be the case that we see a variability as a function of that. I take your comment to suggest that perhaps we should be measuring this kind of individual difference measure in the first wave of our prospective study, so that we could explore potential interactions as a function of this individual difference. Is that what you're kind of suggesting would be useful to look at?
It will be very interesting. So besides education being a broader predictor, sort of, narrowing down, being able to point what exactly is it?
Yeah, and we've thought also about this in terms of like how believable people think this kind of research is too, right? It's sort of the flip side is like when we give you an example of this kind of association, do you even buy it, or do you think it's just, balderdash? So I think that's a good point, that we should keep in mind that there will be individual variability in how people think about these things in the first place. The other question about whether we would like to explore other topics. Yes, absolutely, right? This is really a starting point for this. I mean, if I'm being perfectly honest, the sort of personal motivation for this was a function of our prior work, which wasn't, about the genetic basis of race. It was about sort of biological associations with political identities and outcomes, right? So the immediate sort of first extension of that could have been, right, if we give people biological attributions for political ideology, for example, right, should that increase political tolerance? And that's something that we're also working on designing now, sort of in the broader context of trying to think about more carefully what is political tolerance, right? It's less, I think it's a less clear-cut question than what is racial tolerance, perhaps. There are more sort of normative questions in that respect. And so we're trying to think carefully about not only, what genetic attributions or biological attributions for beliefs should do for this broad conceptualization of tolerance, but also like, what is tolerance, right? What are we talking about when we say tolerance? And so that's something that we're very actively working on now. Other things that we would like to really explore, and I'd love to get any of your perspective on this, is other domains, right? Like which groups? Does it matter what group we're talking about, whether we're talking about dominant groups or subordinate groups? And what kinds of outcomes? Does it have to be a negative outcome, right? Like violence or some negative health outcome? Does it have to be stereotype consistent, like we've used here? Or can it be sort of any kind of outcome as long as it's in a racialized context or some kind of intergroup context? I also have an interest in looking beyond genetic attributions and thinking about biological features more generally. So thinking about, expressing brain structure attributions, broadly more physiological traits, any sort of measure of like our physiological reactivity to things. And then sort of, we were also thinking about how to think a little bit about some of the process by which these connections can be made. Is there a connection through, for example, looking at discrete types of emotions, right? There's some previous work that suggests that old-fashioned racism is particularly associated with disgust responses, whereas these more modern forms of expressions of racism are associated with more anger-based responses. And so these are all things that we have not even come close to exploring yet, but are questions that we're really curious about. Yeah. Thank you so much. That's very helpful to think through.
Thanks, Hannah. Also for giving us a few more research ideas. Hey, there's a question from Nina Obermeyer from the online audience. She writes, thank you for the fascinating presentation. I was wondering whether you were planning to explore outcomes related to less overt racism. I'm thinking particularly of narratives that focus on Black culture, for instance, rather than genes per se.
Yes, I mean, not to make it sound like we want to study everything in the world. We've got trying to go one step at a time. But in some pilot studies, actually, for this work, we did explore sort of expressions of symbolic racism, in addition to expressions of overt racism. And we found some effects on expressions of symbolic racism. We decided to narrow our focus onto expressions of overt racism because of sort of we wanted to start with a clearer theorizing about sort of the relationship between these issues. We haven't really looked at sort of attributions necessarily for culture per se, of course, but that is part of the aim of our proposed second study here, which is to see if there is something specific about these genetic attributions as opposed to sort of broader environmental attributions. So culture isn't exactly being captured in that treatment, right? We're talking about something kind of specific, which is childhood trauma. We're trying to be as ecologically valid here and true to what has been reported in the media in terms of these kinds of associations. So that's part of the reason why we have chosen that type of environmental narrative for the treatment. But thinking more broadly about what is really associated with these kinds of more modern racist attitudes, it is, of course, probably a more cultural explanation, right, that people grab onto. So that would be a really interesting thing, I think, to examine too in the future is instead of focusing on like, what are the horrible things that have to happen to you for you to become a violent person in the future, right, is to look at more mundane relationships between genetic or environmental attributions and sort of other types of outcomes, right? Maybe it's just some health outcome, which is a really common thing to talk about in the domain of genetics, but also it could be things that are really perceived as like positive attributes, right? If we say something like markers of intelligence or athletic ability are really differentiating between different groups, then we might expect totally different perceptions to emerge. So that was kind of a meandering response to that very helpful question, but I hope that sort of gives you a sense of where our thinking is going.
Thanks. I just received an app message that there's a question in the back of the room.
Thank you.
Hybrid.
Yeah. Well, it's like free screens that you do actually.
Very interesting study. I have a question. You started your presentation talking about how people respond when you argue or when you tell them that you study biology and politics, right? We do that too, of course. And I was wondering, what do these results you have found so far, have they learned you anything, or do you draw conclusions from these results regarding how you write about your research and how you talk about the relationships between genes and politics? And does it change how you talk about it?
Yeah, so you're asking how do I take the results from the current research I just talked about to talk about my other research that involves biological associations. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. It does affect the way that I think about how to present that research. To give you a little bit of like very honest backstory, the brain lesion patient paper that Bert mentioned at the beginning, I had a little bit of a debate with my collaborators on how to talk about the implications for that work in the discussion section, and because of this current sort of implications kind of research that we're working on right now, I was sort of feeling increasingly wary, not only about putting that research out there, but being very, 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 very careful about the way in which we discuss it, especially with something I think potentially as inflammatory as talking about brain damage and associating that with sort of a very common political variable like political orientation. In particularly a polarized environment with more political animosity, I was a little bit, not that like I thought that my paper was gonna like change the way that people think about ideology broadly, but insofar as anyone does come across it, I was very concerned. And so we made sure to sort of directly address this issue, right? That this isn't a deterministic story here, right? Even if you have a brain lesion, we know from neuroscience research that the brain is very malleable and is prone to reorganize its own structure, its own functions in response to these kinds of environmental traumas. And so even though we're showing an association here, right, it doesn't necessarily mean this is going to be true all the time. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the brain is going to permanently be fixed in this way as a function of this lesion. So that's just one example, but it really does make me think harder about how I talk about this sort of kind of biology of politics literature more broadly. I teach a class on biology of politics as well, and these kinds of issues have become more front and center in our discussions about how students are reacting to this kind of information and how we should really be careful in interpreting it.
Thanks. There's a question from Natalie Giger.
Okay, many thanks for this fascinating presentation. I have a question of clarification on the exact treatment. So it seemed that like one was much more like basic language than the other, no, with like percentages and so on. And I was just, if you could discuss a bit more, was it only the title and then there was more information, or how the treatment exactly looked like?
Yes, let me see if I can share the screen again with you so you can see. Are you talking about the first study or the second study?
Second, yeah, as well, no?
Okay, so I'll go back to the first study. Let's see here. Okay, do you see?
Yes.
Okay, so this is just a snapshot of the treatments for the first study. So basically what you're seeing on the left side column, or the no race column, right, is the headline that participants would see as the part of the treatment. And then the text in the race/black column is just showing you exactly what the text would look like for specifying the racialized component of it. So the rest of the text doesn't talk about race, doesn't talk about prevalence of the genetic marker in different groups. And this is the only statement of bringing in the racialized context in the broader text. The broader text is a little bit longer and just really talks about like, what is this gene and what kinds of violent outcomes are we talking about. I can try to, I don't have it right. I don't know exactly where it is, but I can try to pull up the full treatment text if you are interested, or share it with you afterwards if you're interested. Would you like to see the second study treatment again?
Just wondering if because the one seemed kind of more, yeah, the language seemed a bit different, no? The one seems more sophisticated language with the than in the no ways condition. That was actually my question. If you have thought about the kind of the understanding people might have, or the scientificness of the treatment.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
I was actually thinking the same now that you brought it up, just about the gene no race conditions as well, because I have the impression that the first statement is just much easier to understand relationship, right?
Yeah.
So that's the same issue there. So it might be that just the second conditional condition just makes you think more, right? Independent of the.
You need to look at the interaction.
Yeah, you just have to think about the entire concept more. It's like a two-step thinking process.
Yeah.
Acoustically more complex.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting point. And I think that that could be certainly part of the process here, right? That is leading to sort of this buffered effect on racist attitudes as a function of this contextualized narrative. We haven't looked at that specifically directly, this question of whether the conditional narrative and the racialized narrative is more complicated, right, and more sophisticated, and so requires a higher level of cognitive processing on the part of the reader, and that affects downstream attitudinal consequences. We have thought a little bit about whether sort of scientific sort of sophistication or scientific, sort of general scientific knowledge should play a role in sort of reacting to these kinds of narratives. So we have talked about including a measure of sort of like scientific, not necessarily in this next study, but in our ideological study plan. We've been talking about including some measures of scientific knowledge and sophistication, as well as asking questions about like, how much do you buy this, this story? Like, how believable is this kind of scientific narrative to you? I will say that for all of our studies, we include a manipulation check, right? Where we try to basically have a reading comprehension question for participants to make sure that they really understood the purpose and the point of the treatments. And so we try to sort of equalize a little bit across participants in terms of their levels of comprehension on the text. But right, that is sort of a little bit of a proxy for the sort of more the theoretical question that you're asking, which is that it might trigger sort of more downstream cognitive processes that are unrelated to the content of the scientific narrative. So that's interesting. How would you suggest that we could control for that or adjust for that? Should we ask questions about basically how difficult it was to read the text or something like that, or do a sort of a pilot test to look at fluency of the text or something? I'm very open to suggestions on this.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
I had the only.
I think you could easily change the treatment to make it a little easier. So I think you could drop the variant of the MAOA at that part and drop the percentages, and I think then you're already there. So would you say this variant, this G was less common among Caucasians and more common among African Americans?
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, so for the second study, to just simplify that text completely.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or increase the complexity of the first one, no?
Yeah, okay. But
Right.
I think the first ones, I think that they read as actual newspaper headlines. They do. And the other texts are not newspaper headlines. That would be my take.
I see. So we were trying to balance a little bit sort of scientific sort of, what's the right word here? The word is escaping me. I'm very sorry. Sort of text that looks more scientific and precise, right? To increase believability, as opposed to just sort of making broad strokes statements about like, well, Black people have more of this gene than white people, and you should just believe us. But you think that we lose something by adding that level of complexity, potentially, or that we should just make it more complex.
Yeah, I just think that the conditions. I think that's what all the comments were about. The conditions could be more comparable.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's very helpful for the next step.
And in terms of the control question, perhaps you can consider something like cognitive sophistication, which is a construct that is typically comprised of like different variables. For example, like you have a measurement on cognitive reflection, you have a measurement on basic scientific knowledge, you have a measure on numeracy, perception, but also bullshit receptivity, which is also something that is often used by some researchers.
What if everyone thinks that our treatment is bullshit? Okay, yeah, these are really good. Oh, I just wrote the same thing. These are really good suggestions. Thank you.
There's one more question, and I think we have a little bit of time left. So Tobias Rohrbach, also online, regarding your which groups question, it would be interesting to apply your design to study gender essentialism and preferences for masculine leaders, and make up a fake leadership gene. There's plenty of research on that. Is this something you've considered somewhere along the line?
Yes. I will say that we don't have really concrete plans yet to examine this in the gender domain. But it does seem like when we've been looking at the literature, especially in terms of thinking about genetic attributions and how they affect perceptions of tolerance in a variety of intergroup domains and a variety of outcome domains, it does seem to us that race and gender are like just the hardest group categorizations to in which genetic attributions might lead to any sort of perceptions of greater tolerance. We're not 100% sure about why this may be. It may be that race and gender in particular seem like particularly genetic or essentialized types of outgroup domains, or that it's just that they have longer histories of being in these kind of hierarchical arrangements. We're not sure. I would love to hear if you have any speculations about this, or more theoretically viable hypotheses as opposed to just speculations like I'm doing. But I think that gender and race are sort of some of the more intractable domains in which this genetic attribution question should have intolerant effects. I like this idea of a design to study how gender essentialism should affect preferences for political leaders, or maybe just leaders in general, in favoring more masculine traits. I mean, this is the tension that we're walking along all the time, is the difference between trying to test the process here about what thinking about genes is doing to people's attitudes, and trying to keep it sort of as ecologically valid as possible, like trying to not make up fake genetic associations between biology and outcomes, because if what we're really worried about is the impact of real science on people's attitudes, I'd really like to be on stronger footing on that issue. But if the question is really about like the process, then certainly we could talk about, like, we can just make up some kind of genetic attribution and see if people buy it, and if they think that should be really important. I would be very happy to talk about potential future directions in this sort of gender domain as well, if you'd like to talk more separately, but I don't have plans for that in the very immediate future.
Okay, Hannah, time does fly when you're having fun, and this was an excellent conversation and a great research topic, and I think all of us interested in this line of work should indeed think a little bit about the consequences of people taking it into sort of a deterministic way, and in that sense, you show some important findings. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. You will at some point in the future receive an actual Hot Politics Lab mock, but for that we will need to travel at some point to a conference. And now, as we are probably going in lockdown tonight again, who knows when that will be. That said, we will continue our Hot Politics series in some form, and I'd like to use the last minute to have announced the last speakers of the year. So next week, we actually meet from 2 p.m. Amsterdam time to 4 p.m. The first hour, we have Yassine Koch, who's a social psychologist from the University of Groningen. In the second hour, from 3 to 4 p.m., we have Jamie Settle, who is a professor of political science from College of William and Mary. She will talk about give a talk titled "What Goes Without Saying: Navigating Political Discussions in America." Jamie is doing some cutting-edge work on political discussion, which is actually very relevant for people from all over the world. Then on November 26th, our own Zoom Meister, Christian Piepal, will give a talk titled "Do Politicians Change Their Rhetoric Over Time?" And Matthijs Gillissen, one of our interns, actually from the Radboud University, will give a talk, "Empathetic Concerns and Party Lines empathy within a party system. And then the week after, we will have Hannah's colleague, Professor Leonie Huddy from Stony Brook University, to talk about nativism and party politics. And the year will be ended on December 10th by Frederick Hopp, whom we just hired at the Amsterdam School of Communication Research, and he will talk about the dissociable moral brain networks that modulate the processing of political messages. So as you can see, quite some diversity in topics and talks and people with different backgrounds and from different institutions. So I'm really excited. We hope to see you in our lab in the coming weeks. And obviously we'll have we'll try to have an equally exciting speaker series for the spring again. So Hannah, thank you very much. Our day is almost over, but you have a long working day ahead of you. So thanks for starting it with us, and we'll hopefully see you in the future in real life.
You're my virtual hot politics mug of coffee for my morning.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me. This was really fun, and I
great.
hope to join again. Yeah.
So Anna,